They weren't just tools of transport, they were lifelines across the world's most unforgiving terrain. From iconic Sherman tanks to the workhorse trucks, these are the vehicles of the Korean War. First up, light tanks. M24 Chaffee, the first American armor to engage North Korean tanks in 1950. It was badly outmatched by T-34s, but bought crucial time for the retreating UN forces. N3 Stuart, already obsolete before Korea began, it served in reconnaissance roles where its lightweight and speed outweighed its vulnerability to anything the North Koreans fielded. M5A1 Stuart, used for screening and liaison duties as heavier tanks handled the actual fighting. Its single radial engine gave it mobility that kept it relevant in a secondary role. Moving on to medium tanks. M4A3E8 Sherman, the Easy-8's high-velocity 76mm gun, finally gave UN crews a fighting chance against North Korean T-34s after the disastrous opening weeks of the war. Then, M4A3 105mm Sherman, its howitzer made it the preferred choice for direct fire against fortified hilltop positions that defined the Korean War's grinding static phase after the front stabilized. M26 Pershing, rushed to Korea in 1950 specifically to counter the T-34. Its 90mm gun could defeat any North Korean armor and ended the brief period of enemy tank dominance. Up next, M46 Patton. The mechanical improvements over the Pershing made this the preferred UN medium tank through most of the Korean War, particularly suited to the peninsula's steep mountain terrain. Then, A27M Cromwell. British forces used this fast cruiser primarily for artillery observation and liaison duties in Korea, where its combat role had been largely superseded by more modern designs. T-34-76. The earlier version was present among North Korean forces during the initial invasion, its sloped armor and wide tracks giving it an advantage over the light American tanks it first encountered. T-34-85, the tank that nearly drove UN forces into the sea in 1950. Its 85mm gun outclassed everything the Americans initially fielded, forcing a desperate response from Washington. Next on the list is heavy tanks. Centurion Mark III. British crews proved this was the finest tank of the Korean War, its 84mm gun and reliable systems performing superbly through both the mobile and static phases. Churchill Mark VII. British forces used this heavily armoured infantry tank in Korea for direct assault support, its thick plating surviving hits that would have finished lighter vehicles outright. Churchill Crocodile. The flamethrower variant proved decisive, clearing German forces from fortified bunkers and tunnels that conventional weapons struggled to neutralize during the liberation of Europe. IS-2, Soviet supplied to North Korea. Its 122mm gun gave communist forces a heavy breakthrough capability that UN planners had to account for throughout the war. Next up, tank destroyers and assault guns. M10 Wolverine. Deployed extensively in the European theatre during World War II, its speed allowed it to engage and withdraw before heavier enemy armor could respond. M36 Jackson. Its 90mm gun made it the most capable American tank destroyer in Korea, one of the few early UN weapons that could reliably penetrate the T-34 at combat range. Su-76M. North Korean forces used this light assault gun throughout the invasion, its mobility allowing it to support infantry advances across the varied terrain of the Korean peninsula. Up next, Su-100. Soviet supplied to communist forces, its 100mm gun could defeat any UN armor fielded in Korea and represented a serious threat that UN tank commanders respected. Moving on to self-propelled artillery. M7 Priest. Its mobile 105mm howitzer provided the responsive fire support that UN infantry desperately needed during the fluid battles of the first year of the Korean War. Now this is the M37 105mm howitzer. Introduced during the Korean War, it offered better crew protection while maintaining the anti-aircraft capability that ground commanders depended on throughout the conflict. M40 155mm gun. Its long-range 155mm gun gave UN commanders the ability to strike North Korean and Chinese positions well behind the immediate front line. M41 155mm howitzer. The ability to displace quickly after firing was essential in Korea, where Chinese counter-battery fire was a constant threat to any artillery position that stayed in place too long. M43 8-inch howitzer. Used against the most heavily fortified North Korean and Chinese positions, Its massive shells were among the largest rounds fired by UN ground forces throughout the entire conflict. Now this is the M44 self-propelled howitzer. Introduced toward the end of the Korean War, it brought improved mobility and crew protection to the 105mm artillery mission across the peninsula. Sexton, Canadian and British Commonwealth artillery units, relied on this 25-pounder self-propelled gun throughout the Korean War for responsive fire support during both offensive and defensive operations. ISU-122, provided to North Korean forces by the Soviet Union, its 122mm gun gave communist armored units a formidable assault capability against UN defensive positions. ISU-152, Soviet-supplied to communist forces in Korea, its 152mm howitzer was devastating against fortifications and one of the heaviest weapons fielded by either side. Next on the list is Self-Propelled Anti-Aircraft, M15 Combination Gun Motor Carriage. Its combination of a 37mm cannon and 2 heavy machine guns provided Allied ground units protection against the low-level air attacks that threatened supply columns during World War II. M16 Multiple Gun Motor Carriage. 4 50-caliber machine guns gave it devastating firepower against Chinese infantry massed for night attacks, earning it a fearsome reputation among ground commanders well beyond its anti-aircraft role. M19 Gun Motor Carriage, twin 40mm guns, made it effective against both aircraft and the concentrations of Chinese infantry that characterized the mass assault tactics used throughout the Korean War. M42 Duster. Introduced late in the Korean War, its twin 40mm guns were equally devastating against Chinese infantry attacks as against aircraft, making it one of the most feared ground support weapons. Moving on to armored personnel carriers and half-tracks. M2 half-track. Used throughout the Korean War for reconnaissance and artillery towing, its shorter frame and agility made it more suitable for the narrow mountain roads that dominated the peninsula. Then, M3 half-track, the primary armored infantry carrier for UN forces throughout Korea. It moved rifle squads forward across terrain that wheeled vehicles struggled to navigate during the fluid first year. M5 half-track, supplied to Allied nations fighting under the UN flag in Korea. Its welded armor construction made it slightly more resistant to the small arms fire that dominated infantry engagements. M9 half-track, used primarily for transport and supply duties in Korea. Its parts' commonality with other half-track variants simplified the maintenance burden that the rough Korean terrain placed on all vehicles. Universal carrier, British and Commonwealth forces used this low-profile tracked carrier throughout Korea for moving weapons teams and supplies through terrain too narrow or steep for larger vehicles. The next one, Oxford Carrier. The M39 armoured utility vehicle served Commonwealth forces in Korea, its improved capacity making it better suited to the sustained operations the war demanded. Then, M39 armoured utility vehicle. Its tank-derived running gear allowed it to keep pace with armour while moving ammunition and supplies forward under fire during the Korean War's most intense armoured engagements. M75 armoured personnel carrier. Introduced during the Korean War as one of the first purpose-built, fully tracked APCS, it marked the beginning of modern armoured infantry doctrine that the war helped accelerate. Next, BTR-40. Soviet supplied to North Korean forces, this four-wheel drive armoured car gave communist infantry units mobile protection during the rapid advance that nearly overran the entire peninsula in 1950. BTR-152. Soviet forces developed this six-wheeled armoured troop carrier in the early 1950s, utilizing it for transport in various motorized rifle units throughout the Cold War. Continuing with armoured cars, M8 Greyhound. Used by UN forces for advanced reconnaissance, its speed allowed it to probe North Korean positions and withdraw before heavier forces could engage it across the Korean peninsula. M20 Armoured Utility Car. Serving as a command and liaison vehicle for UN commanders in Korea, its speed and radio capacity made it essential for coordinating the complex multinational force operating across the peninsula. Now this is the Daimler Dingo. British Commonwealth forces used this compact scout car throughout Korea, its small size allowing it to navigate terrain that larger reconnaissance vehicles could not enter safely. BA-64, Soviets supplied to North Korean forces, this small armoured car performed reconnaissance and liaison duties during the invasion and subsequent operations across the Korean peninsula. Moving on to amphibious vehicles. LVT-3 Bushmaster carried Marines from ship to shore during the Incheon landing that reversed the course of the Korean War. Its amphibious capability making it essential for MacArthur's bold strategic gamble. Up next, LVT-4. Its rear ramp transformed how Marines came ashore at Incheon, allowing troops to exit onto the beach under fire without climbing over the sides of the vehicle. LVT-A4. Armed with a 75mm howitzer, it provided fire support for the Incheon landing. But unlike troop-carrying LVT variants, it did not transport infantry. DUKW, essential for moving supplies from ships to shore during Korean War amphibious operations, particularly at Incheon, where conventional port facilities were unavailable or destroyed. The next one, M76 Otter, its ability to cross the rice paddies and river obstacles that covered the Korean landscape, gave UN logistics units access to terrain that heavier tracked vehicles could not safely enter. Ford GPA. UN forces used this amphibious jeep for crossing the numerous rivers that cut across the Korean peninsula during operations where bridging was unavailable or had been destroyed. Now let's look at tactical and utility vehicles. Willys MB, the universal vehicle of the UN ground forces in Korea. It moved commanders and supplies across terrain so rough that nothing wheeled was supposed to survive it. Ford GPW. Functionally identical to the Willys version and used interchangeably throughout the Korean War, its parts commonality simplified maintenance for mechanics, keeping the UN forces mobile. Next, Dodge WC series. These mid-sized tactical trucks carried the ammunition, communications equipment, and medical supplies that kept UN ground forces functioning across the Korean peninsula's brutal terrain and climate. The next one, Dodge M37. Replacing the wartime WC series during the Korean conflict, it served as command vehicle, ambulance, and general cargo carrier for US and Allied forces across the peninsula. Land Rover Series 1. British Commonwealth forces fielded this newly introduced vehicle in Korea, its all-terrain capability and simple maintenance proving well-suited to the peninsula's demanding operational conditions. Next, Austin K2Y. British forces used this ambulance throughout Korea to evacuate casualties from forward positions across terrain that made every medical evacuation mission a significant challenge for the crew. Gaz-67, Soviet supplied to North Korean forces. This four-wheel drive utility vehicle served as the communist equivalent of the American Jeep throughout the Korean War's various phases. Gaz-69. Introduced during the Korean War period, this improved Soviet utility vehicle served North Korean headquarters and supply units throughout the later stages of the conflict. Next up, motorcycles. Harley-Davidson WLA. Used by US military police and dispatch riders throughout Korea, its familiar engine sound was a common feature of the rear areas and supply routes behind the front lines. Norton 16H. British Commonwealth dispatch riders relied on this motorcycle for message and liaison duties throughout Korea. Its simple design keeping it running despite the peninsula's demanding conditions. BSA M20. Commonwealth forces used this reliable British motorcycle for courier and patrol duties during the Korean War, its low maintenance requirements suiting the austere conditions of the peninsula. The next one, M72, Soviet supplied to North Korean forces. This heavy motorcycle with sidecar option served communist reconnaissance and liaison units throughout the Korean War's various operational phases. Moving on to transport and cargo trucks. GMC CCKW 2.5-ton 6x6. The logistical foundation of UN operations in Korea, the Deuce and a Half moved the supplies that kept every combat unit fighting from Pusan to the Yalu and back. M34 2.5-ton 6x6. Introduced during the Korean War era as an early version of the next-generation tactical vehicle, it began replacing wartime designs in UN supply columns across the peninsula. The next one, M35 2.5-ton 6x6. Its multi-fuel engine and rugged construction made it ideal for Korean conditions, where fuel quality varied enormously and roads ranged from paved highways to mountain goat tracks. M135 2.5-ton 6x6. Its automatic transmission reduced driver fatigue during the long supply runs that sustained UN forces across the Korean peninsula's demanding road network in all seasons. Studebaker US-6, 2.5-ton 6x6. Originally produced for World War II Lend-Lease, Surviving examples continued supply duties with various UN member forces during the Korean War across the peninsula. Chevrolet G506, 1.5-ton 4x4, used by UN forces for lighter cargo and communications duties in Korea. Its smaller size allowed it to reach forward positions that larger trucks could not safely navigate. Diamond T968, 4-ton 6x6. Heavy artillery units in Korea depended on this powerful truck to move field guns and ammunition across the terrain that defines so much of the peninsula's fighting. M54 5-ton 6x6. Its heavy payload capacity made it essential for moving the bulk ammunition, engineering supplies, and heavy equipment that sustained operations throughout the Cold War era. Bedford QL. British Commonwealth forces relied on this truck throughout Korea for supply transport over the peninsula's roads, which ranged from serviceable to effectively impassable. Next, Bedford OXD. Lighter Commonwealth supply runs in Korea fell to this 1.5-ton truck, which handled forward area logistics, where larger vehicles created too much of a target. Morris C8. British artillery units in Korea used this field gun tractor to keep their 25-pounders mobile. The quad's four-wheel drive, managing terrain that standard trucks avoided entirely. AEC Matador. British forces used this artillery tractor to keep medium field guns mobile throughout the Korean War, its pulling power handling the steep gradients of the peninsula's mountain roads. Scammell Pioneer. British recovery units in Korea depended on this heavy vehicle to retrieve tanks and artillery pieces from the difficult terrain where combat and the weather regularly left them stranded. Leyland Hippo. Commonwealth rear area logistics in Korea depended on this heavy transport truck to move the bulk supplies that sustained fighting units through both the mobile and static phases. Up next, Toyota KB. South Korean forces operated this light truck for supply and liaison duties. Its familiarity to local drivers, an advantage in a force that was rapidly expanding to meet the communist invasion. Gaz AA. North Korean supply columns used this Soviet truck throughout the war. Its simple construction allowing field repairs that kept supplies moving even after UN air attacks on transport routes. Gaz MM. The improved version of the standard Soviet cargo truck served North Korean logistics throughout the war, hauling ammunition and supplies across the peninsula under constant threat of UN air attack. ZIS 151. Soviet supplied to North Korean and Chinese forces. Its six-wheel drive made it effective in the mud and snow that characterized Korean winters and slowed all logistics operations. Finally, we have tracked utility, engineering and support vehicles. M29 Weasel. UN forces used this tracked cargo carrier to supply positions across the rice paddies and muddy terrain that wheeled vehicles could not cross during Korea's wet seasons. Then, M31 Tank Recovery Vehicle. Allied armoured units in World War II depended on this recovery vehicle to retrieve tanks disabled by enemy fire or the terrain, keeping operational tank numbers as high as possible. M32 Tank Recovery Vehicle. Its distinctive A-frame crane allowed UN recovery crews in Korea to perform battlefield repairs that kept tanks in the fight, rather than waiting days for depot-level maintenance. M74 Tank Recovery Vehicle. Introduced during the Korean War to handle the heavier tanks that UN forces were fielding, it provided the recovery capability that the earlier M32 could not always manage. Centurion ARV. British armoured units in Korea used this vehicle to recover their Centurion tanks from the difficult terrain, maintaining the operational availability that made the Centurion so effective. Churchill ARV. British recovery crews in Korea used the Churchill's heavy tank chassis to extract vehicles too deeply mired or damaged for lighter recovery vehicles to reach effectively. Now this is the Cromwell ARV. British armoured units used this fast recovery variant to reach and retrieve disabled vehicles quickly during the mobile operations that characterised World War II. The next one, M25 Tank Transporter, the Dragon Wagon, moved tanks long distances across Korea's road network to preserve their tracks and mechanical systems for the fighting, rather than wearing them out in transit. M4A3 Sherman Bulldozer. UN engineering units used this armoured bulldozer to clear roads blocked by landslides and debris, often under fire in the forward areas where the need was most urgent. Caterpillar D7 Armoured Bulldozer. UN engineers used armored D-7s to build and maintain the roads that Korean terrain constantly threatened to reclaim, working under fire in areas where the front lines were never truly stable. Now this is the Caterpillar D8 armored bulldozer, the heaviest bulldozer in UN service in Korea, used for major engineering tasks, including airfield construction, that sustained the air power advantage UN forces relied on throughout the war. M4 high-speed tractor. UN artillery units in Korea relied on this tractor to keep medium field guns mobile during the fluid operations that characterized both the advance to the Yalu and the subsequent retreat. M5 high-speed tractor. Heavier UN artillery batteries in Korea used this tractor to maintain mobility, the ability to displace quickly after firing being essential against Chinese counter-battery fire. M6 high-speed tractor. The largest 8-inch howitzers in UN service required this powerful tractor to move across Korea's terrain, the combination delivering the heaviest ground fire available to UN commanders. M8 high-speed tractor. UN artillery units used this modern tractor to keep their heaviest guns moving during the Korean War, its tank-derived running gear managing terrain that wheeled prime movers could not. Up next, T-34T armored recovery vehicle. North Korean and Chinese forces used this T-34-based recovery vehicle to retrieve their damaged armor under fire, maintaining tank strength during operations against UN defensive positions. YAR-12 artillery tractor. North Korean artillery units depended on this Soviet tractor to keep heavy guns mobile during the offensive operations that drove UN forces to the Pusan perimeter in 1950. The next one, Stalinets S-65, converted from agricultural use, this tractor hauled North Korean heavy artillery across terrain that challenged every vehicle on the peninsula during the opening months of the war. Stalinets S-80, the improved version of the Soviet agricultural tractor, used to move North Korean and Chinese artillery through Korea's winters, conditions that tested every piece of equipment to its limits.